He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an advertising agency strategist, now celebrating his 25th year in the business. And together, we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing conversation about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. All right, Henry, we're back for another episode, and today we're going to talk about a subject I know it's dear to your heart, the role of research in writing a creative brief. So let me just launch in by asking you some questions, and I'm sure I'll have some things to say about it along the way. And I've got my questions all around the edge of my laptop here. You can't see them, but I can. So I'm prepared.
That's a genius.
I know. You know, somebody had to think of it. I guess I'm the first. So what kind of research do you describe as useful when you were writing a creative brief?
So I suppose I should be ashamed of this, but I'm not. I'm a very linear thinker, which seems weird coming from a strategist. But I like to start at the beginning, which means the history of the brand and all that. And I also like to start wide and then go narrow. So I start with publicly available information. Statista has a lot of industry information about different industries. Wikipedia is usually a good place, even though a lot of the stuff might be suspect. There's usually, if you click the footnotes, there's primary sources there that you can actually read and then evaluate whether that's any good or not. Then I look at the industry data that maybe the client was able to provide, the brand tracking, the quantitative things to try to get the sales data, to try to get a picture of what's going on. And then we start honing in now on the consumer, right? So look at the quantitative data from the consumer research. If there isn't any, commission it if you can. And then you get to the dreaded focus groups and the qualitative research. And I think that unfortunately, a lot of brief writers and clients only go straight to the focus groups. And I think that that's a mistake. I think you need to have the whole picture. And then secondly is when you get to the qualitative research, is focus groups actually the best way to get the information you want? And I've become more, let me state first that I think that the best form of qualitative research is ethnography, which is where you have an ethnographer observe and question and be with the subject for several hours, if not several days. Of course, that's expensive as hell, and you're not going to be able to talk to a broad range of people with a limited amount of funds. The next best thing, and what I've been doing a lot lately, is one-on-one interviews with consumers, with some sort of ethnographic homework, like where they have to do a video diary related to things and unrelated to things with regard to clients' business or products. So I really like one-on-ones. And you have to, then there's focus groups, and I think the limitations of focus groups are pretty well documented. You can have groupthink, you can have people that dominate the discussion. You can't go as in-depth with the individual respondents. But I do like to get a loyalist's perspective when I do qual, and then the non-loyalist or the category user who maybe is not a rejecter of your brand, but isn't the loyalist. And it's interesting to know what people love about the brand when they love it, and then what people that are more ambivalent about the brand think about it, because it's how do I get this person to think like this person, right? Like what's the key there? So those are the kind of types of research that I engage in, and I don't rely on any one over the other. I'm looking for trends and patterns and things that maybe the focus groups validate what I saw in the quant, or maybe the quant gives me an idea of who to go and look at and talk to in the qual. So it all overlaps, and I think basically it's an impressionistic painting. You're trying to you're throwing paint on the canvas, and eventually it's going to give you a clearer picture.
I like that you say you try to speak with ethnographers. Are there other professionals out there, say journalists who work in the area of the client's product area, or maybe researchers or academics that you also talk to get their insights?
So, interesting. So ethnographers would be, I would hire them if I were doing a true ethnography. A journalist, I don't speak to journalists, but I do look at a lot of the periodicals, right? So like my automotive client, I have to keep up with the automotive, and I'm a member of several automotive forums, right? So like F-150, like I'm a member of an F-150 forum because I feel like I'm almost like an agent, a double agent in there. Like I'm hearing what real consumers are talking about my clients' products. So I do a lot of that. In terms of like psychologists and stuff, I do not necessarily to get information about the consumer specifically or the product, but certainly when I'm thinking about what's going to make them change their mind or persuade them, what are the cognitive biases that they have, I do like to delve into the psychological literature and say, hey, for example, this is a problem that maybe we can solve with social proof, which is, kind of a cognitive bias. Is there survivor's bias in this particular target? So I do try to, as a strategist, I have to be part psychologist, part anthropologist. So
what are some of the common pitfalls of research?
Well, I think I alluded to it a little bit. One is not being thorough enough, not starting big enough, right? Just going right into, okay, what did the focus group say? The other thing, and we've talked about it a little bit, is taking what focus group respondents say at face value and not really putting it to the smell test and then, challenging that with your own assumptions and with what the real world data is showing. So I think, the temptation, and we're all humans, is to take the path of least resistance. And I think you really need to challenge what you're reading and see, is the assumption that the client makes or that I make initially about this data or this research that I'm looking at, is that assumption correct, or could what I'm seeing actually be being caused by something else? So I'm a contrarian by nature. I'm always looking at but what if that's not true? What if something else is true? And I think that helps a lot, because at the end, when you propose the strategy, you've already bulletproofed it, because you've looked at it, you tried to take it apart. And I don't know that a lot of people have that kind of rigor in their processes.
Is it worth talking to, going back to your point about interviewing consumers, is it worth talking to a consumer who absolutely does not like the product that you're working for and finding out why?
I think there's value to it. Usually the answer is we don't do that, and the reason is because of money, right? Where if you have rejectors, people that for whatever reason hate your brand, it's a long road to hoe, right? To get that person to like your brand, or to even just be ambivalent about it again. And so typically most brands have an opportunity to grow with people that are just ambivalent, not necessarily rejectors. So there's kind of like a lower hanging fruit opportunity. So you don't see a lot of brand rejector research. Sometimes you'll see category rejector research. Why doesn't this person buy this type of product? Why don't they buy smartphones? Or why don't they buy, office machines, or whatever it is? So you'll end up, that could lead to unlocking a whole new market. Is why does this group of people completely reject this category that we work in?
Fighting words among the creative group, which is where I come from as a former copywriter, are words like copy testing or creative testing. Now, I go both ways on it, because I spent a good chunk of my career in direct marketing, so I understand the value of testing. But talk for a minute about your attitudes about copy testing and creative testing as it relates to writing a brief.
Yeah. So I don't think it's controversial to say there are two different types, and you just mentioned, if you're doing direct marketing, a lot of digital marketing nowadays, you do testing, but it's A/B testing, right? You're testing the work to see, because you have a very specific sales goal or click-through goal, a very measurable goal. And so you can tinker with an image or a headline or body copy, and you take one variable at a time, and you have your champion and you have your challenger, right? And you put them in the market and you give them both an opportunity, and you have your champion until a challenger wins, and then you have a new champion. So I'm very much in line with that type of testing. I think the problem comes when you're talking about more brand advertising that's intended to work over time, to make people have fond feelings about your brand. And then the methodologies, I don't think that anybody has ever really found a methodology that tests what we would love for it to test, which is how likely is this advertising campaign to help us get a better reputation over a long period of time. And so what you end up getting is people in a focus group situation saying whether they like it or don't like it. And it's a very abnormal environment, right? Because most consumers are not critics, right? Like they advertising is something they live with. They don't think about it much. They either respond to it or they don't respond to it. It either helps your image or it doesn't help your image. But now you put them in you're paying them to have an opinion, and so they have to formulate an opinion, and they tend to focus on banal things and so it's really, I mean, I always put the question is like, imagine if you tested All in the Family, the famous sitcom, and you tested it the way we test advertising. I can imagine the Yentas saying, I don't like Archie. Can you make him nicer? Why does he have to be so mean? And that would have destroyed the whole nature of the show. So I believe that marketers that resort to that are generally copping out. They trying to cover their butt when it comes to creative testing, because they don't want to pull the trigger. If you're a CMO, a brand manager who's approving creative, you should know your brand well enough to know, is this a good idea for my brand? And to make that judgment. If you still want to do a disaster check, do it, but know what the limitations of focus groups are. You're the marketer. You're the one that's getting paid to make this decision. Don't abdicate that responsibility to a group of randomly recruited people off the street who have no training and no background in marketing.
Okay, one last question. We talked before we started recording about the IPA, which is the oldest advertising organization on the planet. It stands for the Institute for the Practitioners of Advertising, headquartered in London. And in 1980, they started an award show called the Effectiveness Award. And it's been copied, over here in the States too, called the Effies. So what role does the measurement of effectiveness and creativity have on you as you're doing your research? Do you look into what works in terms of effectiveness and why it's effective? Is that a source of information for your research?
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, if you can't prove advertising is effective in some way, and that's again a challenge in brand advertising that's difficult, because it is intended to build up. It's almost like building up an immune system. Like you're building it up, it's slow and it takes time, and you don't necessarily see it overnight. But studying the case studies, the IPA winners, the Effie winners, Les Binet and Peter Field are two British strategists who have done a lot of work with the IPA database, as a matter of fact, to figure out what the commonalities are of the campaigns that are effective. And they've written great papers. In fact, one of them is called The Long and the Short of It, where they talk about short-term sales activation tactics versus long-term brand building tactics. What should that proportion be? Which advertisers have it right and which ones don't, and which industries you need to skew more towards sales activation, et cetera. So it's fascinating. Mark Ritson also has done a lot of work. He has a video series where he uncovers a lot of the Effie winners and talks about like best practices coming out of them. So definitely that helps inform me as a strategist, is like looking at what others, because at the end of the day, other people have invented this wheel, right? Like, why am I going to reinvent it? You can learn, you can always learn from others. And frankly, stealing strategic ideas, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, that's, every scientific advancement we have is built on the previous scientific advancements.
Yeah, well, my favorite saying, or at least one of them, is amateurs plagiarize, professionals steal.
Yeah.
So thank you, Henry. That was good stuff.
Thank you, sir. So Howard, today for our creative review, you sent me a link to some work from TBWA Belgium, of some out-of-home work that they did for McDonald's. The link was in communication arts, and a very interesting piece of creative. So tell me what you think about it.
Well, because this is, again, in response to COVID, I really love how they solve this problem. As a copywriter, as a creative, I'm always looking for the best, the quickest solution possible. The shortest distance between the 2 points is still and always will be a straight line. And when you look at this work, and we'll put it up, in a moment, it's all visual. It's just the pure emotional response of these kids seeing, and we don't see exactly what they see. We see the reflection of it. And this is just pure emotion. I suppose that if I spent a lot of time, I might have been able to come up with a clever headline, or a better copywriter than I could have come up with a clever headline. But I don't care how clever that headline was, it would never match the emotional impact of a child's face dreaming about, oh, I can't go and play with my buddies. I can't go on a sleepover. I can't leave the house, but maybe mom and dad will take me to the drive-in of McDonald's, and I dream of McDonald's. And that captures, these campaign imageries capture that emotion beautifully. I always look for visual solutions. This is, I think, a beautiful execution of no words, just pictures. It's beautiful. I loved it.
Yeah. So, I think we've mentioned before on the show that I worked on the McDonald's account for 5 years. So the first thing is, I agree 100% with you. I think that this campaign, or this executions are so simple, but like a lot of the great creative work, it's the simplicity that makes it great. Working on the brand for 5 years, I came up with a little shorthand note that in my head that I think is clever, but I think it actually reflects the reality of McDonald's. And that is, people hate that they love McDonald's, and they do love it, right? And that's a very complex and weird place to be. People hate that they love McDonald's, and they do love it. And so I think that in a time of pandemic, in a time where we're all feeling down, I think one would be forgiven for giving into a guilty pleasure and saying, you know what, screw it. We've been eating food at home for weeks on end. We've been locked in. The kids haven't had a chance to play. We need fresh air. Just get in the car and see green spaces. And then there's the whole relationship of McDonald's and children, right? Like, it's food that kids like and that they eat enthusiastically, which as a parent is, a big challenge. And so it captures some of that magic there of the brand, of how kids react. And lastly, the golden arches, as a distinctive asset for the brand. And we talk a lot about Byron Sharp and distinctive assets and distinctiveness. The golden arches are the prime, or one of the, even just the fry box is another one, the shape and the color of it, and certain things within the McDonald's brand code that are very important. But the golden arches are probably the most important of their distinctive assets. And it's very reminiscent to me of a spot that I wrote the brief for McDonald's. And the name of the spot is cancha, which means pitch, like a soccer pitch.
Right.
And in the spot, the spot is these guys playing like a pickup soccer game at night, and one guy gets fouled and he's about to take the penalty shot, and the lights go off, and everyone's like, oh, and you hear one of the guys calls out to Marco, just one more minute, and then the light comes back on. They take the penalty shot, the guy misses the penalty shot, and they all start walking off, and that's when you realize they were playing under the glow of the Golden Arches, right? And the premise, if we're talking about creative brief, the premise of that brief was that for Hispanics, and this was a Hispanic spot, that for Hispanics, McDonald's is more than just a fast food restaurant. It was a place, I was really inspired by Ernest Hemingway's short story, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, yes. Right?
Yeah.
And for McDonald's, for Hispanics, McDonald's is a clean, well-lighted place. It's a place of refuge. A lot of times if you're living in Hispanic neighborhoods, particularly historically, they might not be the best of neighborhoods. You might not have access to internet at home, but you can walk into McDonald's with your iPhone or your laptop or your tablet and use the free Wi-Fi. So it becomes kind of an oasis in the neighborhood, and that was what it sought to. So the Golden Arches as a symbol of the brand and the great things the brand can be, I think is really, really moving.
Yeah, one more point about relating this back to the creative brief that I really like about this out-of-home campaign. The article that accompanied the imagery talked about the fact that they had a very low budget. And one of the things I like to point out when I do training on how to write a brief is creatives don't need to know what the budget is, because the budget is an executional aspect of the brief, not part of the ideation. If you have a great idea and it seems to be expensive, creatives will find a way to make it less expensive. They'll want to pull it off. Also, if clients love the idea and it seems to be expensive, they will find a way to come up with the money. But what was great here is that they trusted the photographer that they hired. He took up the challenge and he found a way to make it happen. And one of the things that I really like about this is the fact that none of those imageries that you look at was done in post. That's real photography in the moment. So don't ever let a budget idea hold you back when you're writing a brief, because the creatives just want an inspiration to come up with the idea, and I think they executed brilliantly here.
So I agree with you in principle. I do think, though, that there's a danger of them overshooting, right? Like if they come up with an idea that's all based on CGI. CGI is expensive. Each second of CGI costs X amount of thousands of dollars. So I think having a general idea of the ballpark and then let them figure out how they're going to stretch it, I think it gives them some reality boundaries. But you're right. I generally think that budget is less important than clients and even the account teams make it out to be.
All right, Henry, good stuff. He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Until next time.
See you again.